time period I'm going to talk about today is 1663 and the royal colony in New France. I'm going to discuss absolute monarchy, the organization of the government, the governor general, bishop, intendant, and Jean Talon. Alright, so absolute monarchy. So prior to 1663, the traders sort of ruled in the New World, and in New France and the new colonies, because there was no formalized government. So the traders were the ones who were there. So they made the rules, they enforced the rules, but there was no formal structure or no more government, or there was no representation of the people. It was just people there to make money, and when they were there, the traders were in charge. But around 1663, Louis XIV, who was the king of France at the time, realized that money could be made in this new colony, and he wanted to have control. He wanted to have a say over how this new colony was going to be run. So he established an absolute monarchy. The criteria for an absolute monarchy is he's at the top. The king of France was the top of the government. Everything was made, other decisions were made by him. And only people he selected or appointed would be members of the government. Okay? So only people who the king chose could be in the government. The people had no voice in that. One person ruled. So the people that he would choose to be in his government, they could advise him and give their opinion, but ultimately the decision was his. And he could go completely against what everyone in the government wanted because he had final say. And it was a minority over a majority. So it didn't matter how many people felt one way. If the king believed in something and wanted to do it this way, his voice was the only one that really mattered. There was only one vote, and it was the king's. So here's the structure of the absolute monarchy. Of course, you have the king at the top. And he appoints, that's the red arrow, he appoints his advisors. Now the interesting part about this is this section of the government is in France. It's not in the colony. It's not in New France. So they're making decisions for the people living across the ocean. So we want to keep that in mind. Then the advisors, the king then elects the intendant, the governor general, and the bishop, who are now in New France. So they are representatives of the king, but they are living in New France in the new colony. And they are members of the Sovereign Council. Sovereign Council is the group that makes the decisions and the laws. Everyone in this part of the government came from France. Very rarely was there ever a person who was born in New France who would be a part of the Sovereign Council. So in New France, all of the decisions and all the power lied with people who were still living in France or the people who had come from France. And then there's the people of New France. But they really had no influence and no role in electing the people who represented them. All the power came from above and all the decisions came from above. So this part of the government is in France and this part of the government is in New France. Alright, so the governor general, the bishop, and the intendant. These are the three main roles in this sovereign council that make decisions for the people in New France. And they are appointed by the king. So the governor general represented the king. He was the highest rank in the sovereign council, and he was former military from France. The bishop was a representative from the Roman Catholic Church. So remember, that role is very important. The church had a lot of influence in this new colony. They were one of the members of the Sovereign Council. They were a part of every decision that was made about how this the community, the colony was going to be run. And the intendant, he was sort of the administrator. He was, was in charge of the day-to-day stuff in the colony. All right, so what are their main focus? What are their roles? The governor general was in charge of military planning. He was in charge of native relations, and he was responsible for watching over the other officials. Remember, the king and his advisors are back in France, so they need someone in the new world, in the new colony, that's going to kind of spy on everybody else. The king's not there. He doesn't know what's really going on. So the governor general is given this, sense of status above the bishop and the intendant to kind of say, you need to let me know what's going on, what's really happening in the new colony. The bishop was responsible for the priests and the nuns, overseeing them, the missionaries, the schools, the churches, the hospitals, and to see how the parishes were going in the colony, to see how religion was spreading, to see who was going to church, who wasn't going to church, and report that back to the governor general. And the intendant. Like I said, the intendant is in charge of the day-to-day activity. So the law and order, the finances, and the basic harmony of the people. How are people getting along? What were the conflicts? What groups didn't get along with each other and why? And again, he was to report back to the intendant. I'm saying he because there was never a woman that was in any part of the absolute monarchy or the government at this time. They had no voice, no role. They had no influence, no say in anything. So all of these positions would have been held by men, and these positions would have definitely been held by men who were born in France, and they were appointed by the king. Alright, so Jean Talon, I'm sure it's Talon, but we call him Jean Talon. He was the first intendant in New France. And he was a visionary. He saw this colony as an opportunity for something greater. He really wanted it to be like France, to be prosperous and wealthy. So he wanted to take it from the fur trade, that industry that brought everybody over, to agriculture, so they could sustain life and take care of themselves there, and eventually move to industry, so they could actually make money. And he started shipbuilding, brewing, and shoemaking industry. He wanted New France to not be so reliant on France. France was funding a lot of things in the new colony because they weren't self-sufficient. They couldn't produce things on their own. They didn't have a market. They weren't creating wealth. So Jean Talon had this idea that if he created these industries, that they would start to not have to rely so much on funding from France. And the king supported this growth. He liked the idea that he could have an extension of his country across the ocean. So he gave large dowries to families that were going over. If you had 10 or more children, you got money and benefits. If you had children of marrying age, remember you could marry as young as 14, you were fined. So there was this big encouragement to get people over there, get them to have large families, and get them working on the land. Jean Talon also was in big support of having a militia formed of normally retired armed forces, so people who may have been in the armed forces in France, and when they came to New France, they would be part of the militia. This was means to protect the new colony, which is very important for future lessons.